Let's talk about the shadow. In psychology, the shadow represents a hidden aspect of our personality that doesn't align with our ideal self. Instead of dealing with it, our ego often pushes these traits onto others, creating a kind of emotional blind spot. It's like an invisible inner struggle or an internal enemy. To understand it better, think of how we tend to relate to common human experiences rather than everyone's unique journeys. We begin to notice our shadow when we realize that external situations and influences reflect our inner issues. This realization often comes when we see our mistakes and suffering as linked to our own actions. We start to take accountability for everything that we see around us. But sometimes our ego tricks us into blaming external factors. Society's norms can make us repress our unconscious, pushing us to conform and hide our true selves to fit in with what's considered polite and respectable, even if it means not being genuine. And this is how the shadow is formed. So, when we talk about the shadow, we have to talk about the ideas of good and evil. In Buddhism, good and evil are thought of as opposites within a complex concept called emptiness. Good is seen as something positive and desirable, while evil is often tied to religious beliefs, considered morally wrong or wicked, causing harm or pain. It's also connected to the idea of sin or breaking moral rules. Religious institutions and governments, like churches and states, shape our understanding of good and evil to maintain their authority. This can lead to the belief that regular people are inherently sinful compared to those in power. Rulers, priests, holy figures are often elevated to this godlike status, reinforcing this idea and making people depend on their guidance. These beliefs are enforced through laws and doctrines and principles that emphasize these distinctions. And this is another way that the shadow is formed and reinforced in our world. So, when we talk about the shadow, we're talking about the creation of a false self. The false self is something that's shaped by what institutions like the church and the state tell us about good and evil. And these institutions often trigger what we call the superego in people, our ideal selves. Our ego, which is a big part of our thinking, mostly sees itself through what others say about us. So there is just this return reflection, and that is what we base our view of ourselves on. It doesn't pay much attention to our deeper thoughts and feelings, like those in our subconscious minds or in our hearts or in our intuition. For many of us, our self identity is mainly based on what society thinks and labels us as, and that can make us ignore our deeper thoughts and feelings. Society often tells us that the group is more important than the individual. So we might hide our own needs and wants just to fit in because it is human nature to want to belong. Carl Jung, a famous psychologist, talked about these ideas in his book, The Undiscovered Self, which he wrote during a really tough time in history around World War I. In simple terms, a lot of what we know about ourselves comes from what society tells us. And this can make us miss the important role our inner thoughts and feelings play. Not knowing this can leave us vulnerable to negative influences and attacks in our thoughts and our emotions, making us feel helpless and defenseless, and thus triggering and perpetuating the cycle of the shadow. So, how does the shadow form? According to Robert Bly, when we're very young, our personalities are like complete circles. However, as we grow up, we start hiding the parts of ourselves that our parents or society don't approve of. We stuff these hidden parts into an imaginary bag behind us. And this bag keeps getting bigger as we grow older. And by the time that we're 20, it's pretty full. The rest of our lives are often spent trying to uncover and embrace those hidden parts of ourselves to become our true selves. In doing so, we rediscover the unique qualities and gifts we gave up to fit into a socially acceptable persona. So the question is, in your stage of your life that you are in right now, How unpacked is your bag? So, if we're talking about the shadow, we have to talk about projections. Projections is when we see qualities or traits in someone else that we actually have, but we may not be aware of. It's like looking at your reflection in a clear lake. You recognize yourself, even if the ripples in the water distort the image a little bit. To notice projection, we need to be emotionally aware and acknowledge that what we see in others might be a reflection of our own hidden traits. So, the more emotionally a projection triggers us, the larger the hidden shadow within us. Understanding and revealing our unconscious thoughts and feelings is a way of getting to know ourselves better. If we use our emotional triggers and judgments as signals that we're projecting, we can take a closer look at this dynamic. Here are some examples of projections. Number one, when you have strong feelings about yourself that you don't like, you might project those same intense feelings, qualities, or characteristics onto someone else. Number two, stereotypes. These can be a little harder to spot because they're often supported by a larger group of people, but it's when we assign negative traits to others based on their race, gender, or other factors, which may actually be a part of ourselves that we reject. And sometimes our hidden qualities come out in slips of the tongue, especially when we make fun of someone or criticize them. In dreams, you might see characters doing things that you would never do yourself, which can be a way of projecting your hidden qualities onto a character, a fictional character, a fantasy character, or somebody that is not associated with you, an archetype. So the question is, in what ways have you been projecting? Let's learn our shadow. Here's how to learn about your triggers. Think of triggers like a repeating pattern that shows you something from your past that needs healing. It's like Groundhog's Day until you heal it. Connie Zweig suggests a process called romancing the shadow. So start by finding a quiet space and pay attention to your inner feelings and thoughts. Notice what's happening inside you and give it a name or visualize it. Remember that this inner shadow is not who you truly are. It's not your best self, but it is a part of you. And understand that your reactions in the present are often connected to past experience, and your reactions are often not appropriate for the present. So think about the consequences of letting this inner shadow control your actions. Ask yourself what this shadow part of you needs. Identify the needs it's trying to meet through its reactions, and then try to find healthier ways to fulfill those needs. Give your permission to accept and acknowledge this inner shadow. Accept it. It's just you trying to heal yourself.